Okay, we are live. Welcome everyone back to the Ink Live. I'm Anand Giridharadas. Very delighted to be joined back again on a Monday by the brilliant Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat from NYU, who's a scholar of authoritarianism with, I think, a subspecialty in parades. So, so, Ruth, I'm so glad to have you back in a moment when after a weekend where we had kind of a little bit of a limp parade. We had spontaneous, not at all limp protests around the country. We had, the prospect of World War III breaking out in the Middle East. And then we had these assassination attempt and assassination in Minnesota. So just so much going on and all like disparate, but all connected in these ways that are very striking. So really glad to have you back to process it all. Maybe I thought I would start with the tale of these two attempts over the weekend. Donald Trump's attempt to, as I've been thinking about it, uh, fill the void left by his father's withheld love by throwing himself a military parade, by treating the U.S. Armed Forces as a birthday party rental company, um, and a pretty kind of sparse, weak, chaotic parade. Nothing didn't have the real aesthetics of some of the autocrats you have studied and written about in the past, who really sometimes knew how to throw a good solid parade. This was not that. Um, and then the No Kings rallies across this country, which, in contrast, over delivered. Often had many more people than they were expecting, more people than had turned out in the past. Can you talk a little bit about the parades and the protests and the kind of meaning you draw from both this weekend?
Yeah, so starting with what struck me about this Trump parade is he didn't look happy at his birthday fete, um, and and that was very predictable because these kind of people who maneuver themselves or get in these strong men. They have a very particular psychology, and they have a kind of boundless need to be adulated that can really never be filled.
Yeah.
And so I had always thought, regardless of how many people turned out for his infantile parade, which is separate than celebrating the army. That's and the army was going to have a very different kind of celebration, as it should. It's a powerful big institution, 250 years, and it was going to have festivals. It was going to be very different. So that part, that's fine. That's more than fine. These people risk their lives for our country. They should celebrate the 250 years, but it got co-opted,
What
of
was
course,
not
with
fine was turning it into
the
your own bouncy
yes.
castle.
That's the part. And using the military as props, as he also tried to do. He's trying to we know this, he's trying to politicize the military. His vision of the military is to make it obedient, not to the Constitution or loyal to the Constitution, but his person. And so he created the spectacle around himself, and that's what strongmen do. They personalize power. And in my book, I work with this concept of personalist rule, when literally everything has to be about the leader's person. But he didn't look happy. And that was predictable because he would never look happy. There's no amount of adulation and choreographed bodies. So you had the specter of the kind of array of military strength, all the tanks, everything. And then you had the counter spectacle, which was wildly successful, of the No Kings protests in like 2,500 cities and towns. And the crowd counting consortiums and people are still at work. And it's a very rough science, right, to do that. But what is very important is that, with respect to the early April hands-off protests, we already know that this was far bigger. And so one of the things about resistance is that it's nowadays it's increasingly decentralized, especially in a giant country like the US. It's going to be decentralized. So the collective effort, each time there's a mobilization, a day of protest, it's part of this larger collective action. And the more people turn out, the more others will see and be encouraged to join next time. So we have to think of it as like a forward momentum, and it was wildly successful in that and many other ways.
How do you think about? I can imagine in your field of study of authoritarians of the past, um, you have spent, as I know, a lot of time looking at images and aesthetics and the importance of these things to the larger political projects of a Mussolini or whoever else. Um, Can you just talk about why those aesthetics are so important to regimes like that? I mean, like, even without looking at it, we all know what a North Korean
Yeah.
parade looks like, or a North Korean applause during like a legislature session looks like, or what the Chinese Politburo meetings look like, or the marches that they have. It's such a specific aesthetic that any of us can just like conjure in our head immediately. But I wonder if you can just explain what work those kinds of aesthetics do for regimes like that, why regimes like that seek out those aesthetics, and why it turned out to be so hard for Trump to get that when he wanted it.
Yeah.
I mean, presumably he commands the forces. They're well trained forces. Why was he not? What do those aesthetics do, and why was he not able to get them?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and I still want to analyze more footage of the army marching, for example. Um, but a lot of work goes into creating those crowds. If you are a reader of Lucid, you will have seen that recently I re-upped. Actually, I did this in April 2021 when I hardly had any subscribers because it was less than a month old, Lucid. And it was a very important essay called Crowds and Power. And it talked about exactly this, how there were good crowds that of the type you've just described, and then there are the unruly crowds that get criminalized of protesters. But so much work goes into creating those good crowds. And in real regimes, you like in fascist Italy and other places, you got a postcard. Today would be an email telling you to show up to the rally. Because who would the leader be if no one showed up to his rally or his parade? No bodies were filling the screen. And even back in Mussolini's day, they needed those bodies to generate images for state propaganda. Back then it was newsreels. Now it's other things. So they actually, there's a threat level in a real regime. If you don't show up, I think the Italian thing was you got one pass if you had to go to the doctor or you were sick, but the next time you had to show up, and if you continued not to show up, the secret police would investigate you. They would come to your door. So that's how they got these crowds. There was, of course, some people liked these things and they would turn out. But that gives you a sense of how important the crowds are to the leader and how actually dependent. We should flip it. They're dependent on the crowds because if no one showed up, the actual hatred or indifference for these regimes would be shown. So that's a good way to take the power away from these leaders. Now, in Trump's case, he is an old-fashioned authoritarian in this way, and he likes the specter of bodies arrayed before him at his command, and he is the commander-in-chief. Now, what was very interesting is ideally in a highly militarized kind of authoritarian place, that the army has and the armed forces have been trained to step in a certain way, to march in a certain way, to do body discipline for the camera, right? Because they're not doing that in combat or in other situations. Now here, it was actually a really good sign that the army, a lot of these soldiers, again, I have to look at more footage, they appeared to almost be shuffling. They were not, and why that is, I do not know, but it's a good sign. And then the drone parade, people, a lot of like actual, vets and people who have experience in this, the guy was like marching with like a little toy drone. It wasn't a toy, it was real, but it looked ridiculous. And so, in that sense, it's a good sign that this institution, which, there's a reason General Milley spoke out, General Eaton, they're speaking out because they know that this is bad for the armed forces, that they lose their integrity. And so it's very interesting that he didn't get the spectacle that he wanted.
Yeah, I mean, may I suggest to people around Donald Trump, if they're watching, perhaps they should consider spending less resources on lip fillers and more on seat fillers. Maybe reallocate some of that lip filler budget, splashing around Trump's Washington for seat fillers. It could really help. I mean, I was writing about this morning. What really struck me is you can't make a people what they're not, you
That's
know,
it.
and they're well trained. They're following orders. I mean, we can get into in a moment the extent to which some of that shuffling or whatever else may have been deliberate, may have been its own form of resistance. But it just struck me that, when you see those images from China or North Korea, that's a lot of work being spent
Yeah.
marching in a square of thousands of people in a way that like no pixel is out of place. But in this country, people are not really trained to be pixels, you know,
No,
and and
it's
it's
an
it,
in yeah. Sorry.
it
Go
and it
ahead.
just struck me that like this I wrote this morning like this is the country of jazz that invented jazz. Like I think if you invent the country that invented jazz is not going to be great at like North Korean protest style. Sticking with Korea. This is the country of Korean tacos, where like North Carolina brisket is combined with like Korean kalbi, is combined with corn tortillas from Mexico, is combined with LA kind of flavors and taco traditions. And I don't know, like I just feel like we're Korean taco nation, not North Korean marching nation. And what it suggested to me, and I felt optimistic about this, um, is that it's dangerous. And you and I have talked about this in the past. Like, there's no understating the danger of what is even being attempted with something like that parade. He's
Yeah.
obviously attempting and daring and trying to normalize the scariest possible things. But I also think it's really important at each of these junctures to remember, like, he's up against something quite difficult. Like
Yeah.
he's up against the nature. He's up against just like I watch his videos. Like he's up against who we are, not just certain institutions. He's up against a very deep culture, and that kind of culture is strong and powerful and vibrant and decentralized. Um, and it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the danger is minimal, but I also think there's a risk of like overstating, as we've often talked about, overstating his odds against our nature.
Yeah, that's right. And I had written down really the goal of the fascist or communist authoritarian spectacle is to eclipse and regimes and politics is to eclipse your individuality, the loss of individuality, and the you become one of the collective, both on screen and in every other way. You're just a prop who has to submit to the leader, um, and and so that is what those spectacles are showing, with everyone having to goose step. The Italians had to be one of the most unpopular things that happened in the late 30s in Italy, is that when Italy formally allied with Nazi Germany, the Italian military had to learn to goose step for the public, and they didn't like it. It's also really hard on the body, but the reason you do it is to have a synchronization of everyone. And so that is an outward sign of the loss of individuality. And the one thing about America, we're for good or ill, and the ill part is all the like, self-reliance with guns and all that. But we are a nation of individualists, and 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 a nation where, as you said, there's things that come together in a synergy and create something new. And all of that goes counter to this kind of choreographed. And that's also why I wrote a piece like a while ago called Bukele's Bodies, which was terrifying to write, which is all about this authoritarian spectacle that Bukele is putting out, which Christine endorsed by going to El Salvador, the body that's with all individuality effaced, just masses of bodies that you, the authoritarian, control. And that doesn't work so well in America. And the boisterous nature of all the individual signs and costumes and everything shows that protest, it's serious, but it's also joyous. It's also an expression of your individuality. And as you said, I think it's going to be very hard for Trump to just obliterate all of that. I don't see that happening. That's why I keep talking about a reckoning coming. And this is part of it. It's starting.
Yeah. And when you think about, how easy or hard is it for him to pull off ICE abductions of people? Yeah, that's pretty easy for him to pull off, and he's pulling it off and
Yeah,
he's doing it. What was interesting about Saturday was he was trying to pull off something actually more fundamental, which
yeah,
is to make to fundamentally remake all of our nature.
yeah.
And that is an ambition level qualitatively different from trying to pull off, some abductions. And and it reminds me that he is, yeah, that there is friction there that we should not, lose sight of. Can you tell me about your thoughts about the horrible events in Minnesota and how you think they fit into the moment we're in, but also the project?
Yeah, this is so tragic. Well, been writing about this a long time, trying to warn people. There has been Trump and MAGA use their time while out of office. So we've got 4 years of this conditioning um, to see Democrats as a political enemy, in some cases, an existential threat. Um, and to, after January 6th, to condition people to see violence as having positive and necessary elements at times of crisis. Those are two big vectors that go way back with Trump and some of his the MAGA and the whole treatment of January 6th, and it becomes a patriotic thing that encourages people. The pardons now. But so he came in with this already set up, and there are certain things that he did. For example, re- re- reposting an image. I will never forget this of a pickup truck with a decal, life size, with Biden, who was then president, tied up, uh, horizontal, tied up like a hostage. As though a coup had happened, as though he'd been taken out and something terrible had already happened and something worse would be happening. And Trump posted that. And then they switched that to Kamala when Kamala looked like a very strong contender during the election. So there has been an attempt to delegitimize all important Democrats, even Justin Trudeau. They tried it with him, saying he was a U.S. governor, so that how do I say it? So that people who are contemplating doing something like this that attacks with violence Democrats will feel they have a permission to do so by the leader. So this is what I know from studying fascism. You have this conditioning that happens over time where people feel legitimized and they will even be rewarded perhaps for using violence to go after the opposition, as it's known in other countries. The Democrats are now the opposition party, if we use the language of authoritarianism abroad.
Wow. Um, Tell me about let's go a little deeper into your reading of the No Kings protests. There have been, you and I've talked in the past, there's been anxiety about, are enough people interested? I think you've been a voice of patience, I think, in this, saying like these things take time to build. A lot of us, I think a lot of us look at what's happening in the country and think like it should be everyone automatically. It's so outrageous that the numbers who are outraged should be commensurate. And you've been someone who says, look, it doesn't work like that. No matter how outrageous it is, it has to build. There's social proof that happens. There's it's kind of demonstration effect. There's, you know, people at a level 9 of courage giving people, at a level 8 of courage permission, and then people at level 8 giving people with level 7 courage permission, and so on and so forth. Can you talk about what you saw, how you read it, and where you think it's on the trajectory historically of other such movements?
Yeah, each one is different, but Erica Chenoweth, who developed who's was such an important voice for all things to do with civil resistance, a political scientist at Harvard. They came up with the idea of the 3.5% rule, that even in looking, and because they are political scientists, they generate these vast databases that are comparative, that something that I cannot or would not do. It's not what I do. Um, but that in certain circumstances, now it could, some of these circumstances are when a regime has already been around for a long time and it's hated, it's becoming weak. Then, a 3.5% of the population rising up can convince elites to defect. It creates a historical momentum. But that it doesn't have to be in that extreme case. Like in Poland, in 2023, um, because they know this history, they suffered through this under communism. Donald Tusk, the head of the Civic Coalition, mobilized right before the election the largest demonstration protest movement in decades since the fall of communism. And he explicitly used the language of building something. He said, here, we can't fail now with all of you here. Now, in Poland, again, people suffered under Nazi occupation and under all this, decades of horrible communism. So they know in a way that many Americans don't know intuitively what this means, what the stakes are. But I think the momentum is very important because it does take time, especially in a country like ours, that's the size of ours, the complexity of ours, to build something. And that was a very interesting discussion we had a couple of weeks ago with Jason Stanley on, um, who thinks I'm a bit of an idealist. I think he called me an idealist, uh, and for believing that this is on an upward trajectory. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but definitely the idea that we're just starting something and there is a future to this. And he had a different view, that much more dire. And these are just two views. Um, but it's the key. That's why I mentioned at the beginning, it's very, very important that with respect to the hands-off protests on April 5th, this is much bigger. Even though the government is cracking down, becoming more nakedly authoritarian, even speaking, Kristi Noem, of regime change in Los Angeles, so dire things are happening. Arresting elected officials. Many, many bad things have happened since April 5th. And yet, more people came out. That's what I'm tracking.
Yeah, and I think that people give other people permission, right? People make other
Yeah,
people less afraid,
yeah.
um, and I think that I see that happening also. I wonder how you. I think when I saw the Israel Iran news breakout a few days ago, I mean, on one level, it's just like so awful, and you just have this like feeling in your body of like another thing. And then like a sort of darkly like laughing prone part of me was like great. Like I mean, Israel clearly read the geopolitical room and is like, you know what the world needs? Like one more war, just like one. Let's just see if we can add one more war to the stew, and then see maybe the stew would start tasting really, really good. I wonder how you, on the one hand, this is far away. Um, on the other hand, it's deeply plays into everything that is happening domestically. Um, I saw reports of, the U.S. military preparations to start lending support or backup in the region. There's all kinds of speculation there. You've written about kind of the state of permanent crisis and how it, whether it's LA or whether it's something like this. How do you think the war is going to, people talking about World War III in the chat, not a crazy phrase anymore to throw around. Um, how do you think something like the Iran-Israel conflict plays into what is happening domestically with Trump?
Well, um, so one of the ways, well, let's see, a symbol of one of the ways I'm going to mention is a Marines battalion, an infantry battalion that has a storied history since World War II, has deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan. These are highly trained elite people being deployed to the streets of Los Angeles. And so the very early on, who knows what essay in Lucid it is, but that one of the purposes of the Trump administration would be, and we've seen this in other areas, to destroy the soft and really hard power footprint of America around the world. And it's not so much a turning inward only as symbolized by using these Marines in Los Angeles instead of having them ready if she moves on Taiwan, because that there was that too. There was a huge new exercise of the Chinese around Taiwan. You're bringing the war home, and domestic enemies, Democrats, leftists, immigrants, become the focus. And I really believe one of the kind of bargains, in a sense, is that Trump is there to allow autocrats to do their evil things more easily. So I think my essay was called America Ally of Autocrats, like in March or February. It was very clear to me that that's what's going on, that America will no longer be a deterrent to autocratic imperialisms. Instead, it could tacitly, even whether we don't know the degree, right? It will allow, it's creating the conditions for autocrats to do things more easily without any blowback. And that's also why we talk about destruction of rule of law at home, but it's very important that Trump, and Rubio, and like all these autocrats abroad, have been trying to discredit the ICC, NATO, any organization that exists around the world to reinforce international law, collective security of democracies. All of it has to be destroyed. Anne Applebaum's book, her newest book, is partly about this. So, of course, what do we see? Um, a like Trump saying, "Oh yeah, let's just let Russia fight Ukraine a little longer. Let's be supportive of Netanyahu." And now we see new mobilizations of China. We see Netanyahu thinking it's a good idea to have this conflict with Iran. And so the world becomes much, much more dangerous, because when Trump said that he's going to be for peace, he didn't mean what most people thought. He doesn't mean democratic peace. He means autocrats getting their way and having their new status quo after Ukraine and other hotspots around the world have been solved in the favor of autocrats. That, I truly think that's what he means by peace. It's terrifying. So it's completely predictable that he would get in there. He would start dismantling American power. There was talk of closing military bases abroad also. And then where is he talk? He's, we're going to go into Greenland. Like, it's not a distraction. There's a whole thing behind that. But, and so lo and behold, the world gets immeasurably more dangerous.
I had friends to who went to protest this weekend who got into interesting family conversations with relatives about, well, it's why it's dangerous. Why are you,
Yeah.
taking kids there? Why are you going there? And then there was interesting, well, sometimes it's more dangerous to not stand up. Sometimes it's more, but it's a familiar debate. I think there was a version of it in 2020 with the George Floyd protests in the middle of COVID. Um, how do you think about that? How would you advise people right now who are afraid? They're afraid because of the Minnesota uh, uh, incidents. They're afraid because of what they saw in LA. I mean, they saw a United States senator uh, in California arrested by Trump's kind of thuggish security forces. People are not foolish to be scared, and yet if everyone is scared, they're going to run roughshod over us. Um, how would you advise people who are who want to be brave and are feeling scared? What does history kind of tell them about what they should do?
Yeah, it's really it's hard to advise, because everyone has their own situation. We know this from the history of authoritarianism, because they go after your family. Things can happen. Everyone has their own risk tolerance. It's a little bit connected to also the discourse of how do we think about people who are leaving the country. You know, everyone has their own situations. However, what we know from the history of protest is that numbers matter and that there's safety in numbers. Like any other form of standing up to power, the more there are always a few people who do it first, and they can become isolated, and then they're more vulnerable, or others can join them. And the history of mass protest, uh, emphasis on mass, shows that it's that the more people are out there, the safer it is, actually. That doesn't mean that especially with this government, they're they wouldn't make recourse, which it's they to arrest, manhandling, or worse. And so there, no, it's you cannot advise, because everyone has their own situations, their own responsibilities, their own ethics. But we do know that numbers matter, and that if you look at the history of like the fall of communism or other successful mass movements, as they've swelled, there is more government response, but ultimately there's more. It's for something that can have a concrete outcome.
Um, what is your? I just saw someone I know in the chat ask about naturalized citizens in particular. Should naturalized citizens be especially worried about protesting?
Um, I mean, in theory, this is when you have authoritarians around. Um, Everyone's one of the symptoms is everyone starts to go over their own situation or situations of their loved ones or best friends, and 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 think about the amount of risk they have. My parents were not um, citizens when I was born. Every so that you do that, right? And if you're in a democracy that's healthy, you don't have to do that. um, so yeah, I think it depends what they're going to do with how far they're going to go. But at a big protest, again, we don't know. Are they? We know you should leave your phones at home, but we don't know the surveillance apparatus they're using at protests, and that's where, again, if there's thousands of people, it's much harder for the government to be knowing who each person is. They could film it later. That's what the Chinese do. They let it unfold, like the lockdown protests, and then they looked at the footage, and then later came and got people. So,
I just want to remind everyone that Ruth has an incredible Substack called Lucid, which if you don't know about it, and you know about the ink, or you were just passing through the Substack app, please click here sign up for Lucid from Ruth. If you're a Lucid person, sign up for the Ink. If you don't know about it and just are finding out about it, I would love it. Ruth and I are both part of this wave of people trying to build independent media that can talk like this. At least when I turn on CNN or the big newspapers, they don't necessarily have the conversations we're having. They do other things that are useful and valuable. But I think these kind of conversations, I at least like to believe, are happening in these more independent spaces, and we're trying to build something different here. I think a lot of people on Substack are. If you want to support that work and you appreciate those conversations, sign up, but also become a supporting subscriber if you can. And I'm going to invite folks who are making that decision right now, like a pledge, like those old fashioned pledge drives. Tell us in the chat if you are moved to join us right now and become a supporting subscriber to one or both for the first time. We would love to have you on board, and we'd love you to be part of building a different kind of media. We do this, most weeks. We open it up to everybody. We keep it open to everybody, but we really appreciate it when folks try to support our work and teams and show that there's a different kind of media possible. Um,
Can I just say something about that, Anand?
yeah,
Because it's been now that I'm done teaching for the semester and I'm able to, focus more on my Substack and think about Substack more. Um, I'm thinking about what there are things that big journalistic outlets can do superbly. The data-driven journalism. There's many things they can do. But what I think the contribution of certainly of the ink, all of the interviews that you do and the essays, um, and Lucid's a smaller operation, but same, is that we're able to not just talk about things earlier than some cautious, perennially cautious media outlets might do, but also frame them in a different way and kind of drive the conversation. And so I know this has happened with the ink, and I have actually scooped the Times several times with I'm a 3-woman operation, um, and that's because of this, that we are able to you worked for the Times. I mean, these things. You're really in a very good position to to evaluate what Substack can do versus the merits of big traditional legacy media outlets, but really driving the conversation, posing questions that without fear, and being frank. I think that's a huge merit of the Substacks such as ours.
I agree with that. I think it's several things actually. So I think it's all the things you mentioned. I think it's also I was actually thinking about it this weekend, which such a crazy confluence of events, but also not entirely out of keeping with what we've gotten used to in these times. But you have, World War III potential, you have these assassinations, you have the protests, and you have this flaccid parade. And it occurred to me that you could, of course, get a million bulletins and dispatches and updates about all these things. But what I was craving was the meaning making of
Yeah,
this thing, right? You and I have talked about kind of meaning making in politics, there's also meaning making in media, of putting these things together, right? Just as you were explaining the connection between how an
yeah,
Israel Iran situation then creates different grounds to do things here or label people enemies here or use chaos to justify coercion and suppression here. Um, One of my mantras, people who've read the Persuaders book I wrote will know, like, meaning doesn't make itself. Meaning does not make
yeah,
itself. The meaning of political actions doesn't make itself, but also just the meaning of these developments doesn't make itself. How should one think about
yeah,
the Minnesota assassinations? Is it just, too bad, a really sad story of a, terrible guy? Is this Trump's doing? Is this the kind of thing that one should expect when the rhetoric is like that? How do you think about these different countries, whether it's Israel or the United States or elsewhere, getting courage from each other of the
yeah.
authoritarian kind, right? in many ways, having worked for the New York Times for 11 years, having still being at MSNBC today, um, these institutions are set up, as you said, to do things you and I could never contemplate doing. Um, but that's sometimes less set up to take a swing at what the meaning of
Yeah.
something is, you know?
Yeah. I agree.
And so I'm happy to be part of this experiment with you. Um, Before we go, I wonder um, eh, how you are processing thinking about going back to the beginning, the parade and the protest, right? This kind of attempt to make us something we seem to not be at our core. Um, I don't know. I go back and forth. I see so many things every day that make me feel like, holy shit! Like they've gone much further than I could have imagined. Look what they've done in 5 months. And then I see other things like the parade story that make me think this is like a really big subjugation resistant country. And a lot of bad things are happening, but the country and what it is bigger than this and and has lots of wells of resistance that that we're also seeing. And I really go back and forth between which of those stories dominates in my mind. I think a lot of people watching this probably also go back and forth between those senses. I wonder just personally, where where are you 5
Mhm.
months into this, with all the historical patterning that you have available to you that the rest of us don't have? What do you think we are doing in terms of resistance to this authoritarian breakthrough? Do you think this is breaking through more than you would have feared? Do you think they are having their way with us more than you would have feared? Or do you, at this point, think that the sources of pushback, the sources of resistance and democratic defense are coming into being and surprising you in their own way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. They've had enormous success, and Doge has a lot to do with that, wrecking institutions. We're That's off the page now because of this, the mobilization of military and all that. Nobody's talking about Musk right now, but that's been absolutely devastating. They've launched like a coup with they've used coup tactics. We talked about this before. So they've done enormous changes to the government and to social assistance programs and all that. So that's um that's been successful for them. But uh I think that they did not expect the amount of resistance that they got, and I'm pretty convinced that one of the reasons they decided to escalate in Los Angeles is they didn't expect. It's very threatening to have ordinary people, and it's happened all over the country, come out at some risk to themselves to try and stop these thugs of ICE rounding people up. And authoritarians are very threatened by shows of support to the vulnerable, by people making themselves paragons of like empathy, courage. They don't like that. And so they want the rigid bodies of the parade, right? And the spectators clapping. And of course, Trump has, arranged his cabinet so they do dear leader rituals inside the White House. And that's why, in order to get those people, he has to have like the worst people possible. Like, Noam who shot her dog, like fanatics. They're the people who are going to do the applauding of cabinet meetings. So I think that what I try and do is it's a kind of I need to keep calling out what's going on. I'm able to do that. I'm able to anticipate actually and predict a lot, but I also feel it's really important to also there is a resistance chapter in my book, so I studied that as well, and and we are living through not just an authoritarian aggression, but an active pushback coming from multiple areas of society. Think about all the legal there's been enormous legal successes. So the elites of the legal and other professions and the judiciary, they have pushed back. They have pushed back. And they still are. There's a big machine of that going on. So, and not all the things that happen are necessarily evident to us in real time. The last thing I'll say is that the Tesla protests were really, really important as a model because they combined spontaneous, decentralized protests with an economic boycott. And I think economic boycotts are going to be more important in the future.
Um, well, I think that's a very powerful analysis. I'm going to just, at the risk of self-indulgence, read you the last two sentences of this essay I wrote this morning. Um,
Yeah.
what will always push back against him is this deep inner nature that has stood through time, the chaotic, colorful spontaneity of the American soul. We don't march shoulder to shoulder; we shimmy. So
I love that.
I hope all of you keep shimmying, and I think yeah, I feel both as always uh, clear-eyed and fearful talking to you, but also hopeful about the deep reserves of regular people in this country refusing to be ruled. And I
Yeah.
think for those who share that feeling, I think in some ways it was a good weekend because it was a split screen of two different views of how you get the world you want. Forced spectacles of using a military to salve your wounds for your birthday, or decentralized, spontaneous people coming to defend their own freedom and joining up with other people, as you say, with empathy, often to defending other people besides themselves, defending people more vulnerable than them. An incredibly powerful thing. I continue to believe, maybe I'm wrong. Uh, I continue to believe that what Trump has taken on for himself is far too much for him to succeed at. Um,
I agree.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I hope I'm not. So keep shimmying, Ruth. Thank you for always shedding so much light on all these things. Everybody, sign up for Lucid, subscribe to Lucid, subscribe to the Ink, join us, be part of what we're building. Thank you for tuning in. 3,000 of you in the middle of a Monday. It's so great to be with you all as always. And Ruth, we'll see you soon.
Okay. Thanks to everybody. Always a pleasure, Anand. Bye.
Bye.